The great German composers. Bach. 1. The growth and development of German music are eminently noteworthy facts in the history of the fine arts. In little more than a century and a half it reached its present high and brilliant place, its progress being so consecutive and regular that the composers who illustrated its well-defined epochs might fairly have linked hands in one connected series. To Johann Sebastian Bach must be accorded the title of Father of modern music. All succeeding composers have bowed with reverence before his name, and acknowledged in him the creative mind which not only placed music on a deep scientific basis, but perfected the form from which have been developed the wonderfully rich and varied phases of orchestral composition. Handel, who was his contemporary, having been born the same year, spoke of him with sincere admiration, and called him the giant of music. Haydn wrote, "Whoever understands me knows that I owe much to Sebastian Bach, that I have studied him thoroughly and well, and that I acknowledge him only as my model." Mozart's unceasing research brought to light many of his unpublished manuscripts, and helped Germany to a full appreciation of this great master. In like manner have the other luminaries of music placed on record their sense of obligation to one whose name is obscure to the general public in comparison with many of his brother composers. Sebastian Bach was born at Eisenach on the 21st of March, 1685, the son of one of the court musicians. Left in the care of his elder brother, who was an organist, his brilliant powers displayed themselves at an early period. He was the descendant of a race of musicians, and even at that date the widespread branches of the family held annual gatherings of a musical character. Young Bach mastered for himself, without much assistance, a thorough musical education at Lüneburg, where he studied in the gymnasium and sang in the cathedral choir, and at the age of 18 we find him court musician at Weimar, where a few years later he became organist and director of concerts. He had in the meantime studied the organ at Lübeck under the celebrated Buxtehude, and made himself thoroughly a master of the great Italian composers of sacred music, Palestrina, Lotti, Vivaldi, and others. At this period Germany was beginning to experience its musical renaissance. The various German courts felt that throb of life and enthusiasm which had distinguished the Italian principalities in the preceding century in the direction of painting and sculpture. Every little capital was a focus of artistic rays, and there was a general spirit of rivalry among the princes, who aspired to cultivate the arts of peace as well as those of war. Bach had become known as a gifted musician, not only by his wonderful powers as an organist, but by two of his earlier masterpieces, Gott ist mein König and Ich hatte viel Beklemmnis. Under the influence of an atmosphere so artistic, Bach's ardor for study increased with his success, and his rapid advancement in musical power met with warm appreciation. While Bach held the position of director of the chapel of Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen, which he assumed about the year 1720, he went to Hamburg on a pilgrimage to see old Rehnke, then nearly a centenarian, whose fame as an organist was national, and had long been the object of Bach's enthusiasm. The aged man listened while his youthful rival improvised on the old chorale, "Upon the Rivers of Babylon." He shed tears of joy while he tenderly embraced Bach, and said, "I did think that this art would die with me, but I see that you will keep it alive." Our musician rapidly became known far and wide throughout the musical centers of Germany as a learned and recondite composer, as a brilliant improviser, and as an organist beyond rivalry. Yet it was in these last two capacities that his reputation among his contemporaries was the most marked. It was left to a succeeding generation to fully enlighten the world in regard to his creative powers as a musical thinker. 2. Though Bach's life was mostly spent at Weimar and Leipzig, he was at successive periods chapel master and concert director at several of the German courts, which aspired to shape public taste in matters of musical culture and enthusiasm. But he was by nature singularly retiring and unobtrusive, and he recoiled from several brilliant offers which would have brought him too much in contact with the gay world of fashion, apparently dreading any diversion from a severe and exclusive life, for within these limits all his hopes, energies, and wishes were focalized. Yet he was not without that keen spirit of rivalry, that love of combat, which seems to be native to spirits of the more robust and energetic type. In the days of the old Menzinners, tournaments of music shared the public taste with tournaments of arms. In Bach's time these public competitions were still in vogue. One of these was held by Augustus II, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, one of the most munificent art patrons of Europe, but best known to fame from his intimate part in the wars of Charles XII of Sweden and Peter the Great of Russia. Here Bach's principal rival was a French virtuoso, Marquand, who, an exile from Paris, had delighted the king by the lightness and brilliancy of his execution. They were both to improvise on the same theme. Marquand heard Bach's performance, and signalized his own inferiority by declining to play, and secretly leaving the city of Dresden. Augustus sent Bach 100 louis d'or, but this splendid douce never reached him, as it was appropriated by one of the court officials. In Bach's half-century of a studious musical life there is but little of stirring incident to record. The significance of his career was interior, not exterior. Twice married, and the father of 20 children, his income was always small even for that age. Yet, by frugality, the simple wants of himself and his family never overstepped the limit of supply, for he seems to have been happily mated with wives who sympathized with his exclusive devotion to art, and united with this the virtues of old-fashioned German thrift. 3 years before his death, Bach, who had a son in the service of the King of Prussia, yielded to the urgent invitation of that monarch to go to Berlin. Frederick II, the conqueror of Rossbach, and one of the greatest of modern soldiers, was a passionate lover of literature and art, and it was his pride to collect at his court all the leading lights of European culture. He was not only the patron of Voltaire, whose connection with the Prussian monarch has furnished such rich material to the anecdote history of literature, but of all the distinguished painters, poets, and musicians, whom he could persuade by his munificent offers, but rarely fulfilled, to suffer the burden of his eccentricities. Frederick was not content with playing the part of patron, but must himself also be poet, philosopher, painter, and composer. On the night of Bach's arrival Frederick was taking part in a concert at his palace, and, on hearing that the great musician whose name was in the mouths of all Germany had come, immediately sent for him without allowing him to don a court dress, interrupting his concert with the enthusiastic announcement, "Gentlemen, Bach is here." The cordial hospitality and admiration of Frederick was gratefully acknowledged by Bach, who dedicated to him a 3-part fugue on a theme composed by the king, known under the name of a musical offering. But he could not be persuaded to remain long from his Leipzig home. Shortly before Bach's death, he was seized with blindness, brought on by incessant labor, and his end was supposed to have been hastened by the severe inflammation consequent on 2 operations performed by an English oculist. He departed this life July 30, 1750, and was buried in St. John's Churchyard, universally mourned by musical Germany, though his real title to exceptional greatness was not to be read until the next generation. 3. Sebastian Bach was not only the descendant of a widely known musical family, but was himself the direct ancestor of about 60 of the best-known organists and church composers of Germany. As a master of organ playing, tradition tells us that no one has been his equal, with the possible exception of Handel. He was also an able performer on various stringed instruments, and his preference for the clavichord led him to write a method for that instrument, which has been the basis of all succeeding methods for the piano. Bach's teachings and influence may be said to have educated a large number of excellent composers and organ and piano players, among whom were Emanuel Bach, Kramer, Hummel, and Clementi, and on his school of theory and practice the best results in music have been built. An old instrument which may be called the nearest prototype of the modern square piano. That Bach's glory as a composer should be largely posthumous is probably the result of his exceeding simplicity and diffidence, for he always shrank from popular applause, therefore we may believe his compositions were not placed in the proper light during his life. It was throughout Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven that the musical world learned what a master spirit had wrought in the person of Johann Sebastian Bach. The first time Mozart heard one of Bach's hymns, he said, "Thank God. I learned something absolutely new." Bach's great compositions include his preludes and fugues for the organ, works so difficult and elaborate as perhaps to be above the average comprehension, but sources of delight and instruction to all musicians. The Matthias Passion, for 2 choruses and 2 orchestras, one of the masterpieces in music, which was not produced till a century after it was written, the Oratorio of the Nativity of Jesus Christ, and a very large number of masses, anthems, cantatas, chorals, hymns, etc. These works, from their largeness and dignity of form, as also from their depth of musical science, have been to all succeeding composers an art armory, whence they have derived and furbished their brightest weapons. In the study of Bach's works the student finds the deepest and highest reaches in the science of music, for his mind seems to have grasped all its resources, and to have embodied them with austere purity and precision of form. As Spencer is called the poet for poets, and Laplace the mathematician for mathematicians, so Bach is the musician for musicians. While Handel may be considered a purely independent and parallel growth, it is not too much to assert that without Sebastian Bach and his matchless studies for the piano, organ, and orchestra, we could not have had the varied musical development in sonata and symphony from such masters as Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. 3 of Sebastian Bach's sons became distinguished musicians, and to Emmanuel we owe the artistic development of the sonata, which in its turn became the foundation of the symphony.